How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Gimel, Daf 93 of Masechtas Zevachim. Okay, Daf 93. We continue discussing the topic of Chatas blood getting on clothing and the mitzvah's essay to wash the clothing in the Azar. We are going to wrap up the first Mishnah of the parak that we began. Was it yesterday? Yesterday. And we will learn another Mishnah on this topic. The first section of today's daf is when Chatas blood schpritzes on Tamei clothing. In my opinion, it's an interesting topic. When some of the blood from the Chatas spritzes on clothing, but the clothing is Tamei, because we know from the Mishnah yesterday that if the blood is Psuls, so then it won't be Matami the clothing. What's interesting about this scenario is that since the clothing is Tamei, when the blood lands on the clothing, the blood becomes Psuls, right? The blood becomes Tamei / Psuls. So the question is, will that blood now require the garment to be washed? That is the first section of today's daf. The next section is Psuls that do not require clothing to be washed, right? As we just related in the Mishnah yesterday, we said that if the korban is Psuls, or if the blood is Psuls, so then the clothing that it lands on, that the blood lands on, will not need to be washed. What kind of Psuls are we talking about? And finally, we get to a new Mishnah that also is on the same topic of Chatas blood landing on clothing. More specifically, what are the scenarios in which the Chatas blood would not require the clothing to be washed? Not because it's not because the blood is Psuls or anything, but just because it wasn't the right context / the correct context for Chatas schpritzing. In what scenarios does the clothing need to be washed? Friends, that is the topic or topics for today's daf 93, Daf Gimel of Masechtas Zevachim. Let's go for it. Friends, we are going to begin on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph all the way at the top of the Amud. Ba Mine, Rabbi Bar Chama Rav Chisda. Very exciting. So Rabbi Bar Chama asks Rav Chisda. Now Rav Chisda was Rabbi Bar Chama's father-in-law. Now were they married? Was he married to his daughter at the time? I don't know. But Rabbi Bar Chama asks Rav Chisda, Nitaz al beged Tamei mau. Oh, gewaldig. So what's the halacha when blood from a korban chatas lands on a garment that is Tamei? As I mentioned in the introduction, you see what's interesting here. So we mentioned in, what did the Mishnah say yesterday? The Mishnah had said, Chatas psula ein damaton kibus. That, okay, let's actually read a little bit more from the Mishnah. But the Mishnah said yesterday that a chatas that's psula, or in this case, if the blood is Psuls, that lands on a garment. So the Mishnah had said yesterday, ein damaton kibus, the blood is not going to require the garment to be washed. Now, ben sha'isel shasa kosher, ben shelo shasa kosher, whether the korban was kosher at some point, or whether it was always Psuls, this blood from a Psuls korban will, or in our case, Psuls blood, will not require a garment to be washed, as a mitzvah, as a chiyuv. Now, what's interesting about this scenario, as is going to come up in just a minute, is that you see, so this is a scenario where there was a shasa kosher, right? We're talking about a korban that is a kosher korban, and the blood spritzes on some clothing. And when it spritzes on the clothing, since the clothing is Tamei, the blood, when it lands on the clothing, now becomes Tamei / Psuls as well. But the korban itself is a kosher korban, so it has a shasa kosher. It was a kosher korban. Some blood lands on the garment. Since the garment is Tamei, the blood now becomes Tamei. So the question is, how do we view this? Do we view this as kosher blood that's landing on a Tamei garment, and the kosher blood landing on the Tamei garment is going to require the garment to be washed? Or do we say that since when the blood lands on the garment, it becomes Tamei / Psuls, so the Psuls blood won't require the garment to be washed? Very interesting shiloh over here. So again, Ba'amine, Rabbi Bar Choma, Rav Chizde, Rabbi Bar Choma asks a kasha from Rav Chizde, Nitas al beged Tamei, that if Chatas blood spritzes on a Tamei garment, Ma'u, what is the halacha? Is there a chiyuv? Do we require the garment to be washed or not? Amar V'huna Brei, the Rav Yoshua says, Rav Yoshua points out the distinction that I discussed a minute ago about Shasa kosher, midikamiboya le achi, from the fact that Rabbi Bar Choma is asking this question, Shmamina kasavar oisala Shasa kosher v'nifsila ein dama ton kibus. So clearly, Rabbi Bar Choma holds that when you have a korban that was kosher and then subsequently becomes Psuls, if its blood lands on a garment, the garment will not be required to be washed. Right? That when we say that if the korban is Psuls, so then there's no chiyuv to wash the garment, that is even when the korban was initially kosher. So here we have a korban that's initially kosher, the blood is landing on the garment and becoming Tamei / Psuls, and we want to know, hey, if we're treating this blood as Psuls blood, well then we would not have a requirement to wash the garment, even though the korban was initially kosher. Okay, fine. Now, do we say anemile boza achaze? So do we say that? Look, okay, granted that fine, even if the korban was initially kosher, then it became Psuls, and now it lands on the garment. So even if we say that, okay, now there will not be a requirement to wash the garment since the animal became Psuls. But is that only if it initially became Psuls before it landed on the garment? Okay, so maybe you have a korban. The korban was kosher, but then the korban became Tamei or something, and then the blood from the korban spritzed on the garment when it was already when the korban was already Tamei. If the korban first becomes Tamei and then it lands on the garment, so we'll say, well, since blood from a Tamei korban landed on a garment, so then there will be no chiyuv of kibus bigadim, of washing the garment. Aval b'vas achas lo. But when the blood is kosher when it lands on the garment, but because the garment is tamei, so when it comes into contact with the garment and lands on the garment, so the blood now becomes tamei, right? B'vas achas. It's all happening at once, that the blood is becoming Psuls as it lands on the garment. Well, maybe then we would say that there is a chiyuv of kibus bigadim, or dilma, or perhaps lo shna. Maybe it makes not a difference, and even when the blood becomes Psuls as it lands on the garment, there will be no chiyuv of kibus bigadim. Will be considered like the blood is Psuls, and there will be no chiyuv of kibus bigadim. So that is the very interesting, very technical, but very interesting question that Rabbi Bar Choma asks Rav Chizda. Let me drink a shtickle water. So now Rav Chizda answers Rabbi Bar Choma. Omar Le, he says, Plugta de Elazar v'Rabbanan aliba de Rabba uchdicha metaretz Abaye Azoy. Answers Rav Chizda, and Rav Chizda says, look, there's a machlokes between Rabbi Elazar and the Chachamim when it comes to mechatas, when it comes to the water that's mixed with the ashes of the parah aduma that is used to sprinkle on somebody who is impure with corpse impurity, tumas ames. So of course there's mechatas. We take the afer para aduma, the ashes of the para aduma, we mix it with water, and we sprinkle it on the tamei mace, day 3, day 7. So there's a machlaikes between Rabbi Elazar and the Chachamim when it comes to mechatas. And says Rav Chizda that machlaikes, as explained by Rabbah, which is further explained by Abaye, that machlaikes is relevant to the question of this blood from a kosher korban landing on a tamei garment, and whether there will be a chiyuv of kibus begadim. Here we go. So for the next chunk of the daf, we will be exploring this machlekes about mechatas, right, in its own context, unrelated to our sugya of kibus begadim, and at the very end, we're going to tie it into kibus begadim, meaning this is a separate machlekes about mechatas, which at the very end will pick out just a sliver of this machlekes to then tie it back in to our sugya of kibus begadim. Now, the sign that we learned in a b'raisa, Rabbi Elazar Omer says, Rabbi Elazar, mechata shenitmu mitayrin sharei nida mazin aleh. Okay, here we go. Rabbi Elazar has a very interesting opinion, which is that if you have mechatas, if you have the water that's mixed with the ashes of the paraduma, mechatas. If the mechatas becomes tamei, how does it become tamei? Chveisnish? Maybe a dead sheretz falls in on it. I don't know. So if you have mechatas that becomes tamei, says Rabbi Elazar, it could still do what it needs to do. You could, if that mechatas is sprinkled on a tamei mace, it will work to purify the tamei mace. How do we know this? He says we know this because, after all, a nida, if you have a woman who's a nida, so she's tmeya, and then she touches a corpse and she becomes double tmeya. Now, not only does she have tumas nida, she also has tumas ames. And nonetheless, even though she's a nida, we would sprinkle mechatos on her on day 3 and day 7. Which means that the mechatos, and this is kind of the similarity to our case, the mechatos, as it lands on this woman who's a nida, it's becoming tamei. The question is exactly how do we understand this? But basically you have this woman who's a nida, and we're sprinkling mechatos onto her, and that seems to be acceptable, and we're going to figure out what the nafkaminas are over here. But that's kind of similar to our case, in that you have this garment that's tamei, and you have this blood that's schpritzing on the garment, and as it lands on the garment, it's becoming tamei. So now, Desani, we're learning a brayso. I'm reading that again. Rabbi Elazar says, Rabbi Elazar, mechatos shenitmu mitaharin, that if you have mechatas that became tamei, they can still be used to be mitahir tamei maces. How come? Says Rabbi Elazar, sharei, well, because nida mazin aleh. After all, this seems to be non-controversial. If you have a woman who's a nida and she becomes a tamei mace, so you would sprinkle mechatas on her, even though when it's going to be landing on a woman who's tamei. The Omar Rabbah, okay, we're not done with the proof yet. We have a lot of work to do to exactly understand what the proof is. Right, as Rav Chizda said, there's going to be the opinion of Rabbah, as explained by Abaye. So now we're getting to Rabbah. The Omar Rabbah says Rabbah, Rabbi Elazar b'shittas Rabbi Akiva Rabbah Omra. Now Rabbah says that Rabbi Elazar's rationale, right? This mechatas that's landing on this woman who's a nida is, of course, analogous to our case, right? The mechatas is landing on the nida. She is tmeya. It's going to land on her and become tamei. similar to the blood landing on the garment. Now, Rabbi Elazar is using this as a proof to say that if the Mei Chatas was Tamei in advance, right? If Mei Chatas becomes Tamei, it's still usable. So the question is, how does Rabbi Elazar conclude that from the fact that we can sprinkle Mei Chatas on a Nida, how does Rabbi Elazar use that to conclude that when Mei Chatas becomes Tamei in advance, let's say a dead sheretz falls on it, you can still use it. So Rabbi Elazar comes to that conclusion because he holds like his Rebbe, Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua was one of the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva, was also one of the Asara Arugei Malchus, like his Rebbe, Rabbi Akiva. So Vamarabba says, Rabbi Elazar b'shittas, Rabbi Akiva Rabbi Amra, that Rabbi Elazar was aligned with the opinion of his Rebbe, his teacher, Rabbi Akiva, Damar, who says, Ha'avoras kli al gabi makom tamei, passing a vessel over a tamei place, kemunach dami, it's as if it is resting on the tamei place. The Tanan, as we learned in a Mishnah in Poche, omer chutz l'taner, if you have a person standing next to an oven, v'sheretz b'taner, and there's a sheretz in the taner, i.e., the oven is tamei. V'oshid yadu l'cholon, he sticks his hand over the oven to a window, v'notol es ha'login, and he pulls a flask from the window, v'aviru alpi taner, and passes it over the oven. Rabbi Akiva metamei, Rabbi Akiva says tamei, v'chacham metayin, whereas the chachamim say tahor. Chever, I asked Chat GPT to kind of make me an image describing this. I think it did a decent job. So what do we see in this image? We see in this image a window with a flask in it. That flask, of course, has Mei Chatas in it. Outside of the window is an old school Talmudic oven with an opening at the top of the oven. You got some yid there. I forgot to ask ChatGPT to give him some tzitzis, but he does have a yarmulke. Now, the only thing I would change, and there was another version of this that ChatGPT got a little bit better, but let's just ask this young man to just walk around 45 degrees so that his mom is standing in front of the oven. And now, right, imagine, right, so just do me a favor, Chevra, just in your mind, have this fellow walk around 45 degrees so that he's now standing right in front of us, right at in the front of the photo. And then between him and the house is this oven. And he's reaching over the oven and he's taking the flask from the window and he's pulling the flask towards his person, towards his body, over the oven, over the opening of the oven. Now, in that oven, there's a dead sheretz, which means that the oven is tamei. And was it Rabbi Akiva? Yeah, Rabbi Akiva says that by this bacher taking that flask and bringing it towards him over the oven, that flask is going to become tamei. Okay, so again, so let's read the Mishnah again. It's not first wide line of the Gemara. Omid chutz l'taner, yad is bacher. He's standing outside of the oven. V'sheretz b'taner. There's a dead sheretz in the oven, so the oven is tamei in the inside. V'oshid yadu l'cholin, and the bacher extends his hand over the oven to the window. V'notol es halogin, and he takes the flask from the window, ve'aviro al pitaner, and he brings it towards himself and brings the flask over the oven. Rabbi Akiva metamei, Rabbi Akiva says that the flask and the contents of the flask is tamei. B'chachamim mitayrin, the chachamim say tahor. V'aplige, and the machlokas is the following: Rabbi Akiva savar kimunach dami. Rabbi Akiva holds that essentially when this bacher is bringing the flask towards him over the oven, and the oven is open from the top, we view it as if he placed as if the flask was placed inside of the oven as it passed over the oven. And since the flask was inside the oven, and the oven is tamei on the inside, so the flask is going to become tamei, and therefore the mechatas is tamei. Whereas the Chacham say we don't view it as if it was landed there. So now, as if it landed inside the oven. So how does this relate to the question to Rabbi Elazar's proof? Says Rabbi, right? This is Rabbi explaining. So the shaila was mechatas that becomes tamei. Is it usable? Well, here's the thing. Rabbi Elazar says it is usable. How do we know? Well, because we know that mechatas can be sprinkled on a nida. We also know that Rabbi Kiva's opinion is that when this flask goes over tumah, goes over this tamei oven, it's as though it landed in the tamei oven and itself became tamei, which means that so that approach of Rabbi Kiva as applied to sprinkling mechatas on a nida would mean that as the mechatas goes over the nida and hasn't yet landed on this woman, but is above this woman, it will become tamei. Right? Just like as the flask was above the oven, it became tamei. So as the mechatas is above this woman, even before it lands on her, it will become tamei. And yet we're saying that it's a valid sprinkling, which means that even though essentially you have tamei mechatas landing on this woman, because it's already tamei from the time that it is above her, even before it lands on her, and then it lands on her, and we're saying that it is effective, so that means that mechatas that is already tamei is nonetheless effective when it is sprinkled on a tamei mace. That is how Rabbah wants to understand Rabbi Elazar's opinion when Rabbi Elazar says that mechatas that is already tamei can nonetheless be sprinkled effectively on a tamei mace. Rabbi Elazar's proof is from a nida based on the principle laid out by Rabbi Kiva as Rebbe, that when the mechatas is essentially above tumah, in this case the nida, it will become tamei, and then when it lands on her, it is nonetheless effective, even though it was already tamei. Ve'ez ve'abaye, however, Abaye asks a kasha on Rabbi Moder Rabbi Kiva ba'azah, that Rabbi Kiva, however, admits that if it were not that the bacher was bringing a flask over a oven where he could technically place it in the oven, but what if the mechatas was being sprinkled over the oven, where he's not holding it, it's not in his hand. Once he sprinkles it, it's out of his control. So if you sprinkle over the oven, right? Abaye, however, admits ba'azah, with sprinkling over tumah, when something is sprinkled over tumah, shavira al gabe klecheres tamei, that was sprinkled over a tamei klicheres, or gabe mishkav v'moshav, or over a tamei bed or seat. Well, gabe mishkav v'moshav tamei shehi tahora, the mechatas would remain tahor. So if it's not that it was a flask being pulled over a tamei oven, but if it was mechatas being sprinkled over a tamei oven, right? Imagine you have the tamei person on one side of the oven and the kohen who's sprinkling the mechatas on the other side of the oven and sprinkles towards the tamei person, and it goes over the oven. The mechatas would remain tahor in that case, which kind of flies in the face of the concept of viewing it as though it lands in the oven, because we're saying no. In this case, when it's sprinkled it'll just follow its trajectory over the oven and will not be considered like it landed in the oven and became tamei. Because you don't have things that are matame above, like below, like matame be'oil, right? That meaning you have this mechatas being sprinkled over the oven, and we're saying the mechatas is going to remain tahor, because for it to become tamei, it would mean that when it goes over the tumah, it's making some kind of an oel over the tumah, which is why it's becoming tamei. But oel is tumas oil is very specific. Zayis min ames, you have tumas oil by kizayis min ames. V'shar amayilin li'isui even amunugas, or a stone that has tsaras on it. So Abaye says, look, Rabba, your argument that Rabbi Akiva says kimunach dami, that when something goes over tumah, it's like it's landing on the tumah, doesn't seem to hold up, since Rabbi Akiva has no problem. Rabbi Akiva says that the mechatas remains tahor if it was sprinkled over the oven rather than pulled over the oven. So it is not simply that Rabbi Akiva holds that something that goes above tumah, it's like it landed on the tumah. And in the case of the mechatas and the nida, when the mechatas is being sprinkled on the nida, and the mechatas in its trajectory to land on the nida is for a second over the nida, it will not be considered like it landed on the nida, because it is mechatas being sprinkled, and it won't simply be considered like it landed on the mechat on the nida, and therefore we won't say that by the time the mechatas lands on the nida it was already tamei. No, for it to already be tamei would mean that it became tamei when it was over her, but we don't necessarily see that that's the case. Elo Amar Abaye, rather says Abaye, Duchuli alma lav kemunach tamei. Okay, look, everybody agrees. Even Rabbi Akiva agrees that when tumah goes over something tamei, we don't automatically. When something goes over something tamei, we don't automatically assume that it landed in the tamei thing. We don't assume that. This is the machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim in the photo that we have with the flask of mechatas being brought over the oven. The Rabbi Akiva Savar, the Rabbi Akiva holds Gazrinon Shema Yanuach. Look, the thing is, when this bacher in our photo is pulling the flask towards his person, and he's pulling it over and he's carrying it over the oven, there's a gezerah that since he's holding it and he's controlling it, he might place it down in the oven, which is not a concern by when you're sprinkling. It's unique to when you are holding a object and you are controlling an object. And the rabbis hold that we don't make such a gezerah, and therefore they say that the flask remains tahor. Rabbi Akiva ba'azoya, but when sprinkling mechatas, where once the mechatas leaves your koach and you sprinkle it, there's no controlling it anymore until it lands where it lands. Nafak, once the mechatas is sprinkled and it's out of his control, and it will remain tahor if it goes over the tamei oven, since he's not in control of it anymore, and there's no gezerah that he's going to place it in the oven. Okay, so now coming back to Rabbi Lazar and the Rabbanon in terms of a nida, right? Rabbi Lazar made the argument that mechatas that is tamei is still effective. Mechatas that is tamei can still be effectively sprinkled on somebody who's tamei meis. And what's his proof? His proof is from the fact that we sprinkle mechatas on a nida. How does this prove that mechatas that is tamei is effective? Amar Abaye says, Abaye bedonin tuma kiduma mituma shebaosa shah kamifle. The machlokes is, look, everyone agrees, right? For sure, what's happening here is that when the mechatas lands on a woman who's in ida, of course, at the very least, the mei chatas upon landing is going to become tamei, right? We have a nida, which is also tamei meis, but anyways, she's a nida, and the mei chatas lands on her. Certainly, when it lands on her, the mei chatas is going to become tamei. The question is, would we say that just like it becomes tamei when it lands on her, we would say the same thing about if it was tamei also even prior to it landing on her? Rabbi Elazar says yes, right? That since the sprinkling is effective with mei chatas, that upon landing on her, when it lands on her, it will become tamei. Well, then it's also effective even if it was tamei in advance, right? We've done in tuma keduma, tuma in advance, mituma shabos shah from tuma at that time. That since when the mechatas lands on this woman who's in nida, when it lands on her, it will become tamei, and nonetheless it's effective. Guess what? Even if it was already tamei in advance, we would also say it's just as effective. Ma'asav Danin, Rabbi Kiva says we can make that argument to Ma'asav Danin, whereas the Chachamim say that we can't make that conclusion, and therefore, sure, it's effective by a woman who's a nida, but we can't conclude that if the mechatas were to already have been tamei, that we could still use it effectively. We can't draw that conclusion, argue the Chacham. Rava Omar Duchuli Alma Ein Don. Now, Cheva, just before we look at Rava for a second, I'm not yet going to tie it in to our shaila about the mechata, about the blood of a chatas landing on a garment that's tamei, and how do we view that? Before we haven't yet. I'm not going to tie that in yet, but just note importantly that what we just said with this tuma keduma is basically that's going to be the key to understanding how the tie-in. But let's first see Rava's opinion when it comes to the mechatas and the nida, and then we'll come back to how this all fits in to our sugya of the blood of the chatas landing on a tamei garment. So now, Rava Omar says Rava disagrees with Abaye, and he says that when it comes to mechatas and nida, duchuli alma ein danin, everyone agrees that we're not simply going to assume that mechatas that was already tamei is effective since when it lands, right, the tuma keduma. We're not going to say that since when it becomes tamei, when it lands on her, then we'll also conclude that when it was tamei in advance, it would also be effective. No, everyone agrees. Even Rabbi Elazar agrees. We won't make that conclusion. The machlokes is the following. Rabbi Elazar sover hazaya tzricha shir umitztarfin la'azos. Interesting. Rabbi Elazar's opinion is that mechatas requires an amount. That there needs to be a certain, right? It's not just any amount of mechatos that lands on a tamei meis is effective. There is a minimum required amount of mechatos. And when one drop of mechatos lands on this woman who's in nida, it's insufficient. It's not enough to be mitayr from tumas hameis. Which means that then when the next drop lands on her, it's mitzdarif. It joins together with the first drop that was there. Now, the first drop that was there was already tamei. So now this drop that's already tamei is nonetheless contributing to her purification, right? Because we're saying that there is a shir. What we say, hazot tzricha shir, that there's a requirement of a certain amount of mechatas to be mitayr tamei meis, umitzdarfin, and as drops of mechatas accumulate on a person, the drop joins together with all previous drops, which means that when the first drop lands on her, it's immediately becoming tamei, but there isn't enough mechatas to purify her. Then when the second drop lands on her, it's also becoming Tamei, and join it together with the first drop, which is already Tamei, but the two drops together are insufficient. And then a third drop and a fourth drop, and let's say it takes, 500 drops. By the time that 500th drop, which now finally there's enough mei chatas to purify her, by the time that 500th drop joins together with the 499 drops that were before it, those 499 drops are already Tamei. And nonetheless, these Tamei drops are nonetheless contributing to her purification process. So Rava says that is Rabbi Elazar's argument to say that mechatas that's already tamei can nonetheless be effective in purifying a tamei mace from the fact that we sprinkle a woman who's a nida with mechatas, and the mechatas is going to be accumulating as it lands on her and contributing to her purification even once it's already tamei. Rabbanan Tzaber was the rabbis hold Hazah Ein Tzrich Hashir, whereas the rabbis say Hazah Mechatas doesn't require any amount, and when that first drop lands on her, it's already done its job, and when it landed on her, at that point it became tamei. But there's no conclusions that can be made about if the Mechatas were already to have been tamei. We can't conclude anything about that because this woman who's a nida, when the Mechatas lands on her, she immediately becomes tahor from tumas hameis, and that is that. Now, back to our case of when you have blood from a chatos that lands on a garment that is tamei, and immediately as it lands on a garment that is tamei, the blood is going to become tamei / puzzle. So the question is, do you need to raise the chiyuv of kibus begadim? Do you have to wash the garment? So now I'm going to back up to like the 5th or 6th line of the Gemara, which had said Amar Le, that Rav Chizda had answered Rabbi Bar Chama, who had asked the question by saying Plukta Rabbi Elazar Rabbanon, that question that you asked is a mechlokas between Rabbi Elazar and the Rabbanon, a liba de Rabba based on Rabba, the commentary Abaye, as Abaye answered. Which was, what was Abaye's answer? Abaye had said that when it came to sprinkling mechatas on a nida, Rabbi Elazar had concluded that even mechatas that was already tamei is still effective to purify a tamei mace. And according to Abaye, Rabbi Elazar's reasoning was that since when the mechatas lands on this woman who's a nida, it immediately becomes tamei and it's still effective. We can conclude that also tuma kiduma, that even if the mechatas would have already have been tamei in advance, it would have the same effect. That since it's effective when it lands on her, it would be equally as effective if it would have landed in advance. We could treat it, that would be the same halacha. Whereas the Chacham disagree, and they say, no, when it lands, we only know about when the mechatas lands on her, nothing about previously. Now, to apply that to our case of the blood of a korban chatas landing on clothing, that it's already tamei, well, Rabbi Elazar would say that, well, the blood landing on the clothing that is tamei is no different than if the blood would have already been tamei in advance and landing on the garment. And if the blood was already tamei in advance, it would be puzzle. And if it's puzzle, there will be no requirement of kibbutz begadim. There would be no requirement to wash the clothing. So Rabbi Elazar would say, so Rav Chizda answers that according to Rabbi Elazar, there would be no requirement to wash the clothing because we review the blood as if it was already tamei in advance. Whereas the Chachamim disagree with Rabbi Elazar, and they would say that you would have to wash the clothing. Azoy. Wow. Was that an interesting machlok? Is very technical on the one sense, but on the one hand, but very methodical. Very, very, very methodical. We really had to work through things one step at a time. The blood of a chatos, the clothing is tamei, how it relates to the mechatos and the nida, and advance the machlokes to Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim and Abaye and Rava and Rabba. Very, very, right. It was a lot moving pieces, but very kind of methodical, one step at a time. All right, friends, now we get up to the next section of the daf, psuls that do not require clothing to be washed. Of course, as we have been discussing since the Mishnah yesterday, and of course today as well, that when you have a korban chatas that is Psuls, so then when its blood lands on clothing, the clothing does not need to be washed. Now, we had said in our Mishnah yesterday, and we read it again today, that, and Rav Huna Breda of Yeshua talked about it today, that Chatas psula ein dama tuna ton kibus. I'm reading from the Mishnah. Ben sha'isel shasa kosher, ben shelo isel shasa kosher. Whether at some point this animal was kosher, whether it was not kosher ever. Now we had seen at the end of the daf yesterday that Rebbe holds like Rabbi Akiva, that actually if at some point the korban was kosher, well then its blood will require kibus begadim, even if it subsequently became tamei. So the Mishnah was talking about chatas that becomes possible. Taner Rabbanan the rabbis thought midam ksher v'lo midam psula. That when the pasuk says that if the blood of a chatas lands on clothing, it needs to be washed, so it's talking about midam ksher from the blood of a kosher chatas, not a Psuls chatas. If the animal was initially kosher and became Psuls, damaton kibus, the clothing will require kibus begadim if the blood lands on it. Lo isa la shasa kosher, but if the korban if the chatas was never kosher, for example, pigul or whatever, v'nifsila, and the chatas is Psuls ein dama kibus ton kibus. In that case, Rabbi Akiva would say that there is no chiv of kibus begadim. Rabbi Shimon Omer says, Rabbi Shimon, echad zeh ein dama ton kibus. Rabbi Shimon says it doesn't matter. Rabbi Shimon says that even if it was kosher at some point, still, if at the time that the blood lands on the garment, it's Psuls, the blood is Psuls, so then there will be no chiyuv of kibus begadim. My time, Rabbi Shimon, how come Rabbi Shimon says it doesn't matter? Ksiv, the pasuk says osa, uchsiv midama. In that parsha by kibus begadim, there are two limiting words. One says osa, it. The other is midama, from its blood. Chad leichad aisela shas akosher. One to exclude when it was initially kosher and became tamei, and the other one to exclude when it was tamei milichatchila. Either way, when the blood lands on the clothing, there will be no chiyuv of kibus begadim. Rabbi Akiva says, look, if the korban was tamei milichatchila, if the korban was tamei and Psuls milichatchila, so if the korban was Psuls milichatchila, then there's no chiyuv of kibus begadim. However, the limitation of osa is prat l'truma. Osa, however, argues Rabbi Akiva, is specific to Marika v'shtifa, specifically right in there, as we learned the psukim yesterday, that but together in that parsha it talked about the vessels that the chatas is cooked in. So if it's a copper vessel, you have to wash it out. Rabbi Akiva says you have to wash it out if it is a korban that was cooked in that vessel. However, if truma was cooked in the vessel, you wouldn't have to wash it out. Anyways, he's saying that the osa is not related to kibus begadim, and therefore the only thing being excluded is when it was Psuls milichatchila. Rabbi Shimon the time of the Amar kachim kalim tunim riko shtifa v'choshkein truma. Whereas Rabbi Shimon doesn't need to exclude truma from osa, because he anyways learns out that kachim kalim cooked it, right, that were cooked in vessels, in copper vessels, you don't need to wash out the vessel even for kachim kalim, certainly not for truma. Okay, fine. So Rabbi Shimon says that there will be no chiyuv of kibus begadim if the korban is possible, regardless of there was a shas, a kosher or not. Rabbi Akiva says the requirement of kibbutz begadim will be waived only if there was never a shas kosher, it was never kosher. Friends, and now we get up to the next Mishnah and the discussion of the correct context for Chatas schpritzing. Right? We have been discussing if the animal becomes Tamei, or if the animal becomes Psuls, what if the animal is kosher? When you have a kosher animal and the Torah says that if the blood of the Chatas gets on clothing, there's a chiyuv of kibbutz begadim. In what scenario, right? Is that, well, let's go back to, let's see. What does the Mishnah say? Nitas min atzaver al beged einu ton kibbutz begadim. Right? Well, if the blood spritzes directly from the neck of the animal onto the clothing of the kohen or whoever's slaughtering it, so it does not require kibbutz begadim. So there you have a kosher korban, and yet that would not be a proper context for kibbutz begadim. So again, nitas min atzaver, if the blood spritzed directly from the neck ala beged on the clothing of the offerer, ein ton kibbutz, there is no chiyuv kibbutz begadim. Min hakeren, if it spritzed from the corner of the horn of the mizbeach when the blood was being applied to it, u'min yisod, or if the shirayim was being poured on the yisod mizbeach and it splattered on the clothing of the kohen, enoton kibbutz, there as well, no chiyuv kibbutz begadim. Nishbach ala ritzba, if the blood of the animal squirted all over the floor and never went into a klishares, ve'asafo, and you gather up all the blood frantically, ein ton kibbutz, there is no chiyuv of kibbutz begadim there either, because as we learned earlier in the Masechta, that if blood squirts directly on the floor, it's unusable. Ein ton kibbutz ella, the only context in which there is a chiyuv of kibbutz begadim is dam sheniskabel b'kli v'roy la'azoya, is when blood has been properly received in a klesharis, and it is from the, right, and it is fit for sprinkling, for applying to the mizbeach, as we're going to learn all about in just a moment. It is in that context that if the blood gets on clothing, there will be a chiyuv of kibbutz begadim. So when the blood has been properly received in a klesharis and it is ra'ui le'azah, it is fit for sprinkling and has not yet been sprinkled, if the blood at that point gets on one's on clothing, there would be a chiyuv of kibbutz begadim. Says the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanan the Rebbe Stad, Yochon nitas min atzaver ala beged yei ton kibbutz. Is it possible that if blood spritzes directly from the neck of the animal onto clothing, there will be a chiyuv of kibbutz begadim? Tam lomar asher yizeh lo amarti l'cha elo b'roi la'azoya, that the pasuk says that will be sprinkled. The chiyuv of kibbutz begadim is when it is fit to be sprinkled. Blood that has not yet been received in a klisharis is not fit to be sprinkled. Tanya idoch, we learn another brayso, yachol nitos min hakeren u'min hayisod yeton kibbutz. Is it possible that if it spritzed from the horn of the mizbeach after it was applied, or from the yisod, the foundation of the mizbeach, when the shirayim, the shiari adam, were being poured on the yisod, Talmud lomar asher yizeh prat lezeh shekfar huza, that you will sprinkle, not that is that has already been sprinkled. So basically, when let's actually go weiter for just another minute. Nishbach al ritzba v'chulei, if the blood squirted directly on the floor and you gathered it up, and then that blood, and it was a whole bloody mess, hasulamali, why then do we have to now also say at the end of the Mishnah, ein ton kibbutz ella dam sheniskabel b'chli v'roy la'azoya, that you require kibbutz begadim when it has been received in a klisharis kilu? We already explained it's not when it spritzes from the neck, not from the keren, not from the yisod, not when it spritzes on the floor. Okay, we get it. It's when you receive it in a klisharis. So matam kamer, well, the Mishnah is saying, look, matam nishbach al ritzba v'asafo ein ton kibbutz begadim. How come when the blood squirts all over the floor and you frantically gather it up and get all bloody, there's no chiyuv of kibbutz begadim? The answer is, Lefisha ein ton kibus ella dam shediskal b'chliva lazay. It's because the only time when there is a chiyuv of kibus begadim, it is when the blood has been properly received in a klei sharis and is fit for sprinkling that we're going to learn about just now. It's in that context that if the blood gets on clothing, there will be a chiyuv kibus begadim. And therefore, that excludes if the blood squirts all over the floor and never was received in a kli sharetz. It excludes if the blood squirts from the neck or from the keren or from the yesod, etc. Now the Mishnah had said v'roi la'azoya, and it is fit for sprinkling. Limute mai, what does it mean? It's fit for sprinkling. What, as opposed to what isn't fit for sprinkling? Right? Meaning we said that it was already received in a kli sharetz, and it's fit for sprinkling. When would it be received in a kli sharetz and unfit for sprinkling? Limute kibel pachas michdei azoya b'chli ze ufachas michdei azoya b'chli ze toraro. What if the blood was received in a kli sharetz, but less than the amount necessary for the application to the mizbeach? And then more blood was received in nacha kli sharetz and another kli sharetz, but again, less than the amount necessary for application to the mizbeach. And then they were joined zusammen, the two klis were joined together, and now there is enough blood to be applied to the mizbeach, and then the blood gets someone's clothing. What happens there? So we're saying that would be excluded. It would be a whole discussion now. But that's being excluded. Let me drink a stick of water. I got my Tanya Chavrusa in 20 minutes. Hopefully I'll be done by then. The Tanya that we learned in a Bryce. Rab Chalafta Bar Shaul, Omer says Rab Chalafta Bar Shaul in the context of, once again, Mei Chatas. Kidesh pachis michdei azoya b'chlize, if, I guess, a kohen had mixed water with Ephor Paraduma in a vessel, but less than the amount necessary for sprinkling, ufachos michdei azoya b'chlize, and he made some more mechatos, but also less than a shear of sprinkling in that second vessel. Lo kidesh, it's not going to be kosher mei chatas. V'yibaylu ne'asa kasha b'damau. And what's the halacha when it comes to blood? If less than a shear was received of chatas blood in this vessel and less than a shear in another vessel, would there be a chiyuv of kibus begadim? Do we say hilchasai u'milchsu lo gaminu? Do we say that when it comes to mechatos, it's halacha Moshe Sinai, and we can't extend the laws of mechatos to the dam achatas because it's unique laws by mechatos. It's halacha Moshe Sinai. We can't apply the details of halacha Moshe Sinai to any other place. Or perhaps also my time dichsiv v'tova ba'moyim. Or maybe actually the reason why you need milchatchila, a proper shear by mechatas, is because it says v'tavo ba'moim, in the water, and the water that was there initially, i.e. you're going to take the hyssop, right? It says v'lokach ezav, you take hyssop, v'tavo ba'moim, and you dip it in the water that was there milchatchila, that milchatchila it needs to be a proper shear. Well, hachanami, we could say that same thing when it comes to kibus begadim, ksiv v'tavo ba'dom. That when it says, not lav davka by kibus begadim, but by echatas apnimi, it says v'toval ba'adam, that the kohen will dip his finger in the blood, i.e. the blood that was there with a proper shear the entire time, and that would also then be the context in which there would be kibus begadim. Tashma, come in here, or there's a different version that says itmar, which technically makes a little more sense. Because Idmar to Amar Bzrika Amar Belazar Af Bidam Lo Kidesh, that yes, the same halacha would apply to blood, that if it was less than a shear in a kli sharetz, so then there would be no kibus begadim. Omar Ravet says, Ravet Tanya, you can add the words Nami Achi. We learn in a brisa, v'toval v'lo misapig, that when it says by a chatos apnimi, that the kohen dips his finger into the blood and then he sprinkles it towards the paroches. V'toval v'lo misapig, he dips his finger into the blood. He doesn't wipe around the rims or, no, you dip it into the blood and you take it out. Bidam, I think badam. Achiye bidam shir tvila meikaro, as we said earlier, that there must be a proper amount of blood milchatchila minadam sheba inyon. That essentially, I think we learn out that you have to do 7. Right. So when it comes to a chatas apnimi, there are 7 sprinklings of the blood towards the paroches, and for each sprinkle, he takes his finger out of the blood and re-dips it into the blood. So he dips his finger in the blood 7 times. I'm going to add some words here. V'taval v'tzrich lemichtav b'dam. We need badam. We need the pasuk to say v'taval, that he dips, and we need the pasuk to also say in the blood. Because of Rachmana v'taval, if it only said dipping, ava mina afal pidalek ashir tvila meikaru, I might say, okay, so the kohen needs to dip his finger into the blood. But what if initially there was not a proper shear enough for him to dip his finger into the blood, but then more blood was added to it, and now there is a proper amount? So, because of Achmana Badam, it says in the blood that there has to be a proper shear milichatchilo. Because of Achmana Badam, if it only said in the blood, avamina afilu misapek, I might think that you can even wipe your finger on the vessel and not just a clean dip. Because of Achmana V'taval, it says dip, a clean dip. Min adam sheba inyon l'mutei mai. When we say that min adam, from which we learn that you do 7 dips in the blood, what's it excluding? Rava says, Rava l'mutei shirayim sheba etzba. Interesting. That when he dips his finger in the blood and sprinkles it towards the paroches, whatever blood is left on his finger is psuls, can't be used. That remaining blood is psuls. And this supports Rabbi Elazar, Damar Belazar, shirayim sheba etzba psulin, that any leftover blood on the finger is psuls. Amarle Ravin bar Rav Ada. I'm going to make a little change here. Ravin bar Rav Ada says to Ravi, Amar Tamidcha, Amar Rav Amram, that your student says in the name of Amram Tanina, that we learn in a brisa in this case, Hayamazet, that if a person was sprinkling, I believe that this is Chatas, I believe. Is this bechatos? No, sorry. Bechatos apnimios. Okay. Bechatos apnimios, right. Okay, blood. V'nitza hazah miyado. So he was sprinkling the blood of the chatas apnimi, and some blood got on his clothing. So ad shelo hiza ton kibus. We're going to have to explain what this means. But until he sprinkles, there's a requirement of washing your clothing. Mishahiza, once you've sprinkled, ein ton kibus, there's no chiyuv of kibus begadim. My lav achikam, this is what it's saying. Ad shelo gomar milahazos ton kibus. What it means is that at any point, if the blood gets on his clothing, if at any point, so long as he is still mid 7 sprinkles, right, he's got to sprinkle 7 times and dip his finger into the blood 7 times and sprinkle. If during that entire process, whether we're talking about the blood, whether we're talking about the shirayim of the blood, anything, if any blood gets on his clothing, he will require kibus begadim. Mishe gomar the azos, once he has completed all 7 azos and he's done, well, at that point, ein ton kibus begadim. Then there will be no longer chiyuv. But the question is that this brisa seems to be saying that there is a chiyuv kibus begadim from shirayim. No, this is what it's saying. Ad shelo yatzaso azoya miyado taon kibus. No, there's a chiyuv kibus begadim if prior to there ever having been any sprinkling. So prior to that first sprinkle, so if blood gets on his clothing, so there will be a chiyuv kibus begadim. Once there's shirayim, however, there is no chiyuv kibus begadim. Mishiyatzusa hazay miyado. Once he's already sprinkled the blood, and whatever remaining blood there is leftovers, ainton kibus. There's no chiyuv kibus begadim. Ezvi Abaye asked the kasha gomer milahazos mikanech yado begufa shapar. Now this goes back to mechatos. It says there by mechatos that this, I believe, was that after they slaughtered the mechatos, after they slaughtered the para aduma on Har Hazeisim, the kohen would then sprinkle the blood of the para aduma in the direction of the heichel in the base mikdash, and it says gomer milahazos, that when he's completed, done, so you would sprinkle the blood towards the base mikdash 7 times. Once he's done with that, mikaneach yodo begufa shaparu, he would then, when he was done with all 7 sprinklings, he would wipe his hand on the para aduma. Gomer in, lo gomer lo. But that was only once he was done sprinkling. But all the while, until then, he wouldn't be cleaning his hands, which means that he's sprinkling towards the Beis Hamikdash with blood that includes shirayim from the previous sprinkles, because he's sprinkling 7 times. Lo, no. On my lay, he says, who says? I think Rava says, Gomar mikaneach yodo begufa shapar. Look, at the end of all 7 sprinkles, he cleans his hand on the paraduma itself. He wipes his hand on the paraduma. Lo gomar mikaneach etzbo. But when he's not yet done with all 7 sprinkles, he cleans his finger. Well, I understand that we're saying, look, when he's done with all 7 sprinkles, he wipes his hand on the par aduma and cleans his hand that way. Since the pasuk says, you're going to burn the cow. And it says there, as orav, as besara, the as dama, and its blood. So I understand when we're done sprinkling, you'll clean your hand on the para aduma, because then we're going to burn the para aduma with everything, including its blood. So you want to wipe off all blood on the para aduma. But we're saying that he's also cleaning his finger after each sprinkle, so that there's no shirayim. What's he cleaning it with? He's not going to be wiping it on the para aduma, because then you're going to get like hair and stuff mixed into the blood, and we don't want that. Abai says, Abai bisfas mizrak. He would, between sprinkle, he would clean his finger on the edge of the bowl that was there. That the bowls were called kfor ezav, and as Rashi points out, this is borrowed. Right, this is like the phrase in the Gemara at Masechta Gittin, when the Gemara describes when the Romans destroyed Yerushalayim. It says lichapure yade. I believe that this was Neron Caesar, I think, who said that that the Rebbeinu Shalom is going to want to clean his hands on whoever did this terrible thing to Yerushalayim. Anyways, so he would clean the blood off of his finger after each sprinkle on the bowl that was there. But yeah, the shirayim, however, would be Psuls. Friends, that was Daf Tzadi Gimel of Masechta Zevachim. Okay, the first part, I think the biggest, most intense part, I think, was really the first chunk of today's daf, when Chatas blood spritzes on Tamei clothing. I thought it was a very interesting, very technical, but very methodical kind of discussion. The Chacham said that when that happens, washing is, you do have to still do kibbutz begadim. Right? The whole shaila was that when the blood lands on the clothing, it's becoming tamei. So would there be a chiyuv kibbutz begadim, since essentially the blood is Psuls? Chacham say yes, there is nonetheless a chiyuv kibbutz begadim. Rabbi Lezer says that there is no chiyuv kibbutz begadim. This was a question that was posed from Rabbi Bar Chama to Rav Chizda, and Rav Chizda answered based on a machlokas between Rabbi Lezer and the Chacham when it came to mechatas, and that was applied here to kibbutz begadim. We then discussed the psuls that do not require clothing to be washed. We had seen, so maybe I'll start with Reb Shimon, because that was the opinion in the Mishnah, that whether or not it was ever kosher, right? If the korban is Psuls now, there will be no chiyuv kibbutz begadim, whether if at any point the animal was kosher. Whereas Rabbi Akiva says, only if it was never kosher. If at any point the animal was kosher, then there's no chiyuv kibbutz begadim. Only if it was never kosher, then there is no chiyuv kibbutz begadim, right? I don't know. I feel like I confused myself with double negatives. Right. To waive kibbutz begadim, it would have to have never ever been kosher. If at any point it was kosher, there would be a chiyuv kibbutz begadim according to Rabbi Akiva. And then we discussed the correct context for chatas, schpritzing blood from a klisharis that has enough blood in it. Right, that if you have a korban chatas and its blood was received in a klisharis and it's ro'i la'azoya, which means that milchatchila there was enough blood to be able to apply to the mizbeach, that is when there's a chiyuv kibbutz begadim if the blood gets on one's clothing. But if, for example, the blood squirted directly on the floor, or if it was after the hazah, for example, during pouring the blood on the yisod mizbeach or whatever, or if it was a less than a proper shear, in those cases there would be no chiyuv kibbutz begadim. Friends, that was Daf Tzadi Gimel, Daf 93 of Masechta Zevachim. Hope you enjoyed. Cheers.